Hey Ecofictologists, my name is Lovis and today I'm bringing you the second video in my Ecofiction in Other Media series. Today we're talking about films. I think it's really interesting to talk about ecofiction in media other than books because the method of storytelling is so different. When we talked about video games, the storytelling is very user-driven, and in many games the story that emerges is different from player to player depending on the choices that they've made in gameplay. Books, unless they're choose-your-own-adventure books, are very much like films in that all the choices have been made for the reader or viewer, and so they just have to sit back and relax. So what can film do for ecofiction? Maybe it's something along the lines of seeing is believing, or out of sight, out of mind. We put a lot of stock in what we can see. With a film, you don't have to have a wild imagination to visualize what's happening. They've just said, here, look, this is what it looks like. And often that can be something wondrous and beautiful, and sometimes it can be something awful and heartbreaking. Either way, pictures do make us feel things, and an emotional connection is really the best way to get a message across, or at least captivate the viewer to carry on with the story. But I think the biggest thing that film can bring to ecofiction is the sheer reach that it has. If Hollywood were to shift its focus to telling more ecological stories, think how many people would be affected by that choice. And films are things that people talk about in everyday conversation, so it can be a good way to incorporate ecological messages and topics into everyday conversation as well. Eco-cinema, where climate is often a main theme, can be done in a range of ways. Either the film wants to get a scientific, ecological message across, or it just uses it as a delivery mechanism to deliver a different message, or climate can be a backdrop to tell another story entirely. However it is featured, the fact that climate and climate change feature at all shows an awareness of the situation and can help reduce the distance that we have between society and nature, something we've incorporated into our lifestyle. But eco-cinema doesn't have to be only about climate change. It can also be about the love of nature or our interaction with it. I'm not going to talk about documentaries because obviously those are fact and not fiction, so they don't fall into the ecofiction category. But many people think that an environmental film or an ecological film has to be a documentary, and it really doesn't. Interestingly, when I was doing my research for this, my favorite examples that I found were animated films that were aimed at children. The films for adults often fall into this disaster movie category because it's a lot of tension and drama and explosions maybe, and that's what holds our attention. But for children, you can really tap into a bit more wonder and magic because they still believe that the world is magical and that they don't understand everything. So I'm actually going to focus on some examples of animated films for children and leave the more dramatic examples for another time. So engage your inner child and let's get into it. Environmental themes might be difficult to talk about with kids because it's kind of depressing and it's so big that they might not be able to take it all in, but that's why kid-friendly movies with a green theme are a great way to start that conversation. So much of the green movement in all its forms is coming from the younger generation who have inherited this mess and they're going, no thank you. And it's so important to start talking about these topics as early as possible. The first movie I'm going to talk about is one from my childhood and one that I think probably at least 90% of you will have seen. I'm going to talk about Bambi, the 1942 Disney classic. The reason I wanted to talk about this film is because it's a perfect example of the influence that a film can have on the actions and opinions of viewers. Everyone remembers the scene where Bambi's mother gets shot, right? It's arguably the most traumatic scene in cinematic history. But what you might not know is that this film ignited a heated controversy between hunters and people who opposed hunting. Hunters even demanded that the film have a disclaimer at the front that said, "This is a fantasy world and this in no way reflects the sportsmen of America," because they felt it put them in too much of a negative light. This film exemplifies something that's come to be known as the Bambi effect, where we care far more about the protection of animals that we think are cute, and we tend to anthropomorphize their pain more than we would something less adorable, like a toad. This led to a huge rise in hunting opposition and created the emotional connection needed for conservation activism. This did protect the deer population in the United States, but it almost did it too well, to the point where the population boomed and they became almost a pest who are not so afraid of humans, and they venture out into the road or into people's gardens. Suddenly, people didn't like them so much. We can see this charismatic megafauna effect in conservation efforts today. Most people are more likely to donate to a charity that protects one of the celebrity species, the cute and cuddly panda, the majestic lion, the mysterious tiger. You get the idea. But these guys need your help too. It's not their fault. This is probably due mostly to human nature and our recognition of intelligence or feeling in these animals, and did not start with Bambi. But that film had such a profound effect on the public that the Bambi effect is still very much relevant 75 years later. An emotional connection can make people care, and people can do big things when they care. The next film I want to talk about is another blast from the past. It has a very special place in my heart. It's Fern Gully, The Last Rainforest. It came out in 1992. Not only do Robin Williams and Tim Curry have voice roles, which can only produce a great film, but the film also taps into that magic that children still believe in. The villains in this film are loggers that go into the Australian rainforest and cut down trees that still sustain an unseen magical community of fairies. The loss of the trees and the immense amount of pollution produced by the logging activities sets free a creature called Hexus, a greedy spirit of destruction who feeds on pollution, poisoning trees and rivers, and as he gains power and aims to destroy Fern Gully. One of the loggers, Zach, is magically shrunk by Krista, one of the fairies, and he's invited into her way of life where he gains a new appreciation for nature and realizes that the way of life he comes from is very destructive. He, I suppose, represents everyone watching who needs to be convinced that nature has a value just as it is, and that laying waste to forests and destroying natural habitats can only lead to some ugly thing gaining power. The film is set in Australia on land that is culturally significant to the Australian Aboriginals, which has also experienced deforestation, pollution, and agricultural clearing. Hexus, the villain, makes a point of saying that greedy humans will always help suck the wildlife and landscape dry. The way that Zach behaves at the beginning shows our ignorance of the pain that wildlife feels when we cut it down or clear its habitat. We have very little understanding of the effect that our progress has on the environment, but we're all too happy to participate. Batty, another character in the film, says, "Truth doesn't always win friends, but it sure can influence people." The director of Fern Gully actually still receives hate mail from logging companies for his portrayal of them. I guess the truth hurts sometimes. A more recent example of ecofiction in children's films features some of these cuddly creatures. Happy Feet tells the story of a colony of emperor penguins who are experiencing a hard season of finding food. Mumble, the main character, stands out from the rest of his species, but his adventurous nature and his need to prove himself ultimately lead him to discovering why their food supply has been disrupted. Commercial fishing trawlers have been fishing in the same waters that the penguins hunt in and have been harvesting the fish stocks at an unsustainable rate. The short food supply forces Mumble to investigate and to try and communicate with the humans that they're disrupting the natural balance of the food web. By the reaction of the humans when they do get this message, it's clear that they made the decision to fish there with an incomplete understanding of the ecosystem. And this is true for most exploitation of natural resources. But we have more information now than ever, and we have the ability to model and predict the knock-on effects of commercial fishing and calculate maximum sustainable yields based on population dynamics and biological knowledge. Like they say in the film, we don't want to live in a world without penguins. Telling this story from the point of view of a cute and cuddly character like Mumble and his penguin pals It's a great way to create that emotional connection between what is quite a complex concept and the kids who are watching. Penguins gotta eat. For this next one, we are traveling way into the future and actually off-planet. This ridiculously cute film highlights the potentially devastating effect of our throwaway culture. Wall-E is a robot who was built to clean up the planet while we humans waited patiently on a spaceship for Earth to be able to sustain life again after we buried it and poisoned it with rubbish and turned it into a dust planet. From the advertisement images that are still flickering against the gigantic piles of rubbish, it's very clear that we as a society still felt that we just wanted more and more, and we hadn't changed our behavior whatsoever. When the captain of the spaceship sees footage of what the planet has become, he says, "But where's the grass? Where's the blue sky?" These are things that we take for granted, but they are things that we could lose if we continue to dump waste into our environment. The plan was to be in space for 5 years, and humans have now been in space for 700 years, which is just an illustration of our immense capacity to underestimate the consequences of our actions. "Oh, this'll be a cinch to clean up, no worries." And then, bit more of a problem. If only we had known that before. We did, we do, but now we have to act on it. The last one on my list is The Lorax, which is, of course, an adaptation of the 1971 book by Dr. Seuss. The newest film version of the book is set in a future city where everything is digital, artificial, nothing grows anymore, even the air you breathe is bottled because otherwise it's too fumey and toxic. Companies in the film come up with business ideas that increase the need for their products, even if it harms an already devastated environment. This is because all the trees surrounding the city were cut down for commerce, leaving the land barren and unable to sustain any kind of wildlife. A young boy hears the story about how it all happened and hears about a little creature called the Lorax, the speaker for the trees, who tried to protect the forest. The song "How Bad Can I Be," sung by the Onceler, who cut down all the trees in the first place, does not pull any punches when it talks about the right and wrong of the companies who are responsible for deforestation and resource exploitation. It also highlights how companies often spin the truth to make their actions look defensible, and how they use marketing campaigns to make them look charitable and good-natured. And they can only do this because we keep buying their products. It's a vicious cycle. A line from the song, "All the customers are buying, and the money is multiplying, and the PR people are lying, and the lawyers are denying. This is also gratifying. So what if a couple of trees are dying? How bad can this possibly be?" The way I'm talking about it actually doesn't make it sound like a kid's film, but it is. It's actually a really beautiful, feel-good film, and even though a kid watching it might not get all of the messages and meanings behind the song and the film itself, the seed has been planted, and that idea is there, and the connections have been made, and it's just going to simmer away until they have all the remaining pieces to put it all together. But the overarching message of the story is something that every child can understand, and in the words of Dr. Seuss himself, "Unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's not." And that is the message I'm going to leave you with, because I think it's a really good one. We can each make a change in our lives to combat anthropogenic climate change and habitat destruction. And if we don't, no one is going to do it for us. I like the idea of involving kids in this conversation. I think it's really important, and I think films are a great medium to spark their imaginations and get them to take these values forward in their lives. I mean, just the 5 films we've just talked about have covered deforestation, pollution, unsustainable fishing, waste accumulation, hunting. That's quite a breadth of storytelling, and that is by no means an exhaustive list. There are many other children's films that have an environmental message. So I challenge you to go find one, and to sit down and watch one with your kids if you have them, and then have a conversation with them about the environmental message afterwards. And if you don't have kids, well, that has not stopped me from regularly watching films for children. It's good for the soul. So that's all from me. I'll see you next week, Ecofictologists.